Chapter 46 of the Lamplighter. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna Cummins. Chapter 46. There are swift hours in life, strong, rushing hours, that do the work of tempests in their might. Hemans. It ran as follows: My daughter, my loving, tender-hearted girl, now that your own words encourage me with the assurance that my worst fear was unfounded, the fear that my name was already blasted to your young ears, and your father doomed by your young heart to infamy, now that I can appeal to you as to an impartial witness, I will disclose the story of my life, and, while I prove to you your parentage, will hope that my unprejudiced child, at least, will believe, love, and trust her father, in spite of a world's injustice. I will conceal nothing. I will plunge at once into those disclosures which I most dread to utter, and trust to after explanation to palliate the darkness of my tale. Mr. Graham is my stepfather, and my blessed mother, long since dead, was, in all but the tie of nature, a true mother to Emily. Thus allied, however, to those whom you love best, I am parted from them by a heavy curse, for not only was mine the ill-fated hand, oh, hate me not yet, Gertrude, which locked poor Emily up in darkness, but, in addition to that horrid deed, I stand accused in the eyes of my fellow men of another crime, deep, dark, and disgraceful. And yet, though living under a ban, wandering up and down the world, a doomed and broken-hearted man, I am innocent as a child of all intentional wrong, as you will learn, if you can trust to the truth of the tale I am about to tell. Nature gave and education fostered in me a rebellious spirit. I was the idol of my invalid mother, who, though she loved me with a love for which I bless her memory, had not the energy to tame and subdue the passionate and wilful nature of her boy. Though ungoverned, however, I was neither cruelly nor viciously disposed. And though my sway at home and among my schoolfellows was alike indisputable, I made many friends and not a single enemy. But a sudden check was at length put to my freedom. My mother married, and I soon came to feel, and feel bitterly, the check which her husband, Mr. Graham, was likely to impose upon my boyish independence. Had he treated me with kindness, had he won my affection, which he might easily have done, for my sensitive and impassioned nature disposed me to every tender and grateful emotion, it is impossible to measure the influence he might have had in molding my yet unformed character. But the reverse was the case. His behavior towards me was that of chilling coldness and reserve. He repelled with scorn the first advance on my part, which led me, at my mother's instigation, to address him by the paternal title, an offence of which I never again was guilty. And yet, while he seemed to ignore the relationship, he assumed its privileges and authority, thus wounding my feelings and my pride, and exciting a spirit of rebellious opposition to his commands. Two things served to embitter my sentiments and strengthen my growing dislike for my overbearing stepfather. One was the consciousness of my utter dependence upon his bounty. The other, a hint which I received through the mistaken kindness of a domestic who had always known the family, that Mr. Graham's dislike to me had its origin in an old enmity between himself and my own father, an honorable and high-minded man, whom it was ever my great pride to be told that I resembled. Great, however, as was the warfare in my heart, power rested with Mr. Graham, for I was yet but a child, and necessarily subject to government. Nor could I be deaf to my mother's entreaties, that for her sake I would learn submission. It was only occasionally, therefore, when I had been, as I considered, most unjustly thwarted, that I broke forth into direct rebellion, and even then there were influences ever at work to preserve at least outward harmony in our household. Thus years passed on, and though I did not learn to love Mr. Graham more, the force of habit, the intense interest afforded by my studies, and a growing capability of self-control, rendered my mode of life far less obnoxious to me than it had once been. There was one great compensation for my trials, and that was the love I cherished for Emily, who responded to it with equal warmth on her part. It was not because she stood between me and her father, a mediator and a friend. It was not because she submitted patiently to my dictation and aided me in all my plans. It was because our natures were made for each other, and as they grew and expanded, were bound together by ties which a rude hand only could snap and rend asunder. I pause not to dwell upon the tenderness and depth of this affection; it is enough to say that it became the life of my life. At length my mother died. I was at that time, sorely against my will, employed in Mr. Graham's counting house, and still continued an inmate of his family. And now, without excuse, or even warning, my stepfather commenced a course of policy as unwise as it was cruel, and so irritating to my pride, so torturing to my feelings, and so maddening to my hot nature, that it excited and angered me almost to frenzy. He tried to rob me of the only thing that sweetened and blessed my existence, the love of Emily. I will not here recount the motives I imputed to him, nor the means he employed. It is sufficient to say that they were such as to change my former dislike into bitter hatred, my unwilling obedience to his will into open and deliberate opposition. Instead of submitting to what I considered his tyrannical interference, I sought Emily's society on all occasions, and persuaded the gentle girl to lend herself to my schemes for thwarting her father's purposes. I did not speak to her of love; I did not seek to bind her to me by promises; I hinted not at marriage; a sense of honor forbade it. But with a boyish independence, which I have since feared was the height of folly and imprudence, I sought every occasion, even in her father's presence, to manifest my determination to maintain that constant freedom and familiarity of intercourse which had been the growth of circumstances, and could not, without force, be restrained. At length Emily was taken ill, and for 6 weeks I was debarred from her presence. As soon as she was sufficiently recovered to leave her room, I constantly sought and at last obtained an opportunity to see and speak with her. We had been together in the library more than an hour, when Mr. Graham suddenly entered, and came towards us with a face whose harshness and severity I shall not soon forget. I did not heed an interruption, for the probable consequences of which I believed myself prepared. I was little prepared, however, for the nature of the attack actually made upon me. That he would accuse me of disobedience to wishes which he had hinted in every possible way, and even intimate more plainly than before his resolve to place barriers between Emily and myself, I fully expected, and was ready with my replies. But when he burst forth with a torrent of unqualified and ungentlemanly abuse, when he stormed and raved, imputing to me mean, selfish, and contemptible motives, which had never for a moment influenced me, or even occurred to my mind, I was struck dumb with surprise, impatience, and anger. But this was not all. It was then, in the presence of the pure-minded girl whom I worshipped, that he charged me with a dark and horrid crime, the crime of forgery, asserting my guilt as recently discovered, but positive and undoubted. My spirit had raged before; now it was on fire. I lifted my hand and clenched my fist. What I would have done, I know not. Whether I should have found words to assert my innocence, fling back the lie, and refute a charge as unexpected as it was false, or whether, my voice failing me from passion, I should have swept Mr. Graham from my path, perhaps felled him to the floor, while I strode away to rally my calmness in the open air, I cannot now conjecture; for a wild shriek from Emily recalled me to myself, and turning, I saw her fall fainting upon the sofa. Forgetting everything, then, but the apparently dying condition into which the horror of the scene had thrown her, I sprung forward to her relief. There was a table beside her, and some bottles upon it. I hastily snatched what I believed to be a simple restorative, and in my agitation emptied the contents of the phial in her face. I know not what the exact character of the mixture could have been, but it matters not; its effect was too awfully evident. The deed was done, the fatal deed, and mine was the hand that did it. Brought suddenly to consciousness by the intolerable torture that succeeded, the poor girl sprung screaming from the sofa, flung her arms wildly above her head, rushed in a frantic manner through the room, and finally crouched in a corner. I followed, in an agony scarce less than her own, but she repelled me with her hands, at the same time uttering piercing shrieks. Mr. Graham, who for an instant had looked like one paralyzed by the scene, now rushed forward like a madman. Instead of aiding me in my efforts to lift poor Emily from the floor, and so far from compassionating my situation, which was only less pitiable than hers, he, with a fierceness redoubled at my being, as he considered, the sole cause of the disaster, attacked me with a storm of jeering taunts and cruel reproaches, declaring that I had killed his child. With words like these, which are still ringing in my ears, he drove me from the room and the house, a repulsion which I, overpowered by the misery of contrition and remorse, had neither the wish nor the strength to resist. Oh, the terrible night and day that succeeded! I can give you no idea how they were passed. I wandered out into the country, spent the whole night walking beneath the open sky, endeavoring to collect my thoughts and compose my mind, and still morning found me with a fevered pulse and excited brain. With the returning light, however, I began to realize the necessity of forming some future plan of action. Emily's sad situation, and my intense anxiety to learn the worst effects of the fatal accident, gave me the strongest motives for hastening, with the earliest morning, either openly or by stealth, to Mr. Graham's house. Everything also which I possessed, all my money, consisting merely of the residue of my last quarter's allowance, my clothing, and a few valuable gifts from my mother, were in the chamber which I had there occupied. There seemed, therefore, to be no other recourse for me than to return thither once more, at least, and having thus resolved, I retraced my steps to the city, determined, if it were necessary in order to gain the desired particulars concerning Emily, to meet her father face to face. As I drew near the house, however, I hesitated, and dared not proceed. Mr. Graham had exhausted upon me already every angry word, had threatened even deeds of violence, should I ever again cross his threshold, and I feared to trust my own fiery spirit to a collision in which I might be led on to an open resistance of the man whom I had already sufficiently injured. In the terrible work I had but yesterday done, a work of whose fatal effect I had even then a gloomy foreshadowing, I had blighted the existence of his worshipped child, and drawn a dark pall over his dearest hopes. It was enough. I would not for worlds be guilty of the added sin of lifting my hand against a man, who, unjust as he had been towards an innocent youth, had met a retaliation far, far too severe. Still, I knew his wrath to be unmitigated, as well aware of his power to excite my hot nature to frenzy, and resolved to beware how I crossed his path. Meet him I must, to refute the false charges he had brought against me, but not within the walls of his dwelling, the home of his suffering daughter. In the counting-house, where the crime of forgery was said to have been committed, and in the presence of my fellow clerks, I would publicly deny the deed, and dare him to its proof. But first I must either see or hear from Emily, before I met the father at all. I must learn the exact nature and extent of the wrong I had done him in the person of his child. For this, however, I must wait, until, under cover of the next night's darkness, I could enter the house unperceived. So I wandered about all day in torment, without tasting or even desiring food or rest, the thought of my poor darling tortured Emily ever present to my wretched thoughts. The hours seemed interminable. I remembered that day of suspense as if it had been a whole year of misery. But night came at last, cloudy, and the air thickened with a heavy fog, which, as I approached the street where Mr. Graham lived, enveloped the neighborhood, and concealed the house until I was directly opposite to it. I shuddered at the sight of the physician's chaise standing before the door, for I knew that Dr. Jeremy had closed his visits to Emily more than a week previously, and must have been summoned to attend her since the accident. Finding him there, and thinking it probable Mr. Graham was also in the house at this hour, I forbore to enter, but stood effectually concealed by the cloud of mist, and watching my opportunity. Once or twice Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, passed up and down the staircase, as I could distinctly see through the side-lights of the door, which afforded me a full view of the entryway, and presently Dr. Jeremy descended slowly, followed by Mr. Graham. The doctor would have passed hastily out, but Mr. Graham detained him, to question him regarding his patient, as I judged from the deep anxiety depicted on my stepfather's countenance, while, with one hand resting on the shoulder of this old friend of the family, he sought to read his opinion in his face. The doctor's back was towards me, and I could only judge of his replies by the effect they produced on the questioner, whose haggard, worn appearance became more fearfully distressed at every syllable that fell from the honest and truthful lips of the medical man, whose words were oracles to all who knew his skill. I needed, therefore, no further testimony to force upon me the conviction that Emily's fate was sealed, and, as I looked with pity upon the afflicted parent, and shudderingly thought how immediate had been my agency in the work of destruction, I felt that the unhappy father could not curse me more bitterly than I cursed myself. Deeply, however, as I mourned, and have never ceased to repent my share in the exciting of that storm wherein the girl had been so cruelly shipwrecked. I could not forget the part that Mr. Graham had borne in the transaction, or forgive the wicked injustice and insults which had so unnerved and unmanned me as to render my hand a fit instrument only of ruin. And as, immediately after the doctor's departure, I watched my stepfather also come down the steps and walk away, and saw, by a street lamp, that the look of pain had passed from his face, giving place to his usual composed, self-complacent, and arrogant expression, and understood by the loud and measured manner in which he struck his cane upon the pavement, that he was far from sharing my humble penitent mood, I ceased to waste upon him a compassion which he seemed so little to require or deserve, and pitying myself only, I looked upon his stern face with a soul which cherished him for no other sentiment than that of unmitigated hatred. Do not shrink from me, Gertrude, as you read this frank confession of my passionate, and at that moment deeply stirred nature. You know not perhaps what it is to hate, but have you ever been tried as I was? As Mr. Graham turned the corner of the street, I approached his house, drew forth a pass key of my own, by means of which I opened the door, and went in. It was perfectly quiet within, and no person was to be seen in any of the lower rooms. I then passed noiselessly upstairs, and entered a little chamber at the head of the passage, which communicated with Emily's room. I waited here a long time, hearing no sound and seeing no one. At length, fearing that Mr. Graham would shortly return, I determined to ascend to my own room, which was in the next story, collect my money and a few articles of value, which I was unwilling to leave behind, and then make my way to the kitchen and gain what news I could of Emily from Mrs. Prime, the cook, a kind-hearted woman, who would, I felt sure, befriend me. The first part of my object was accomplished, and I had descended the back staircase to gain Mrs. Prime's premises, when I suddenly encountered Mrs. Ellis coming from the kitchen, with a bowl of gruel in her hand. This woman was a recent addition to the household, introduced there a few weeks before as a spy upon my actions, and intolerable to me on that account. She was well acquainted with all the particulars of the accident, and had been a witness to my expulsion from the house. She stopped short on seeing me, gave a slight scream, dropped the bowl of gruel, and prepared to make her escape, as if from a wild beast, which I doubt not that I resembled, since wretchedness, fasting, suffering, and desperation must all have been depicted in my features. I placed myself in her path, and compelled her to stop and listen to me, but before my eager questions could find utterance, an outburst from her confirmed my worst fears. "Let me go!" she exclaimed. "You villain, you will be putting my eyes out next." "Where is Emily?" I cried. "Let me see her." "See her!" replied she. "You horrid wretch! No, she has suffered enough from you. She is satisfied herself now, so let her alone." "What do you mean?" shouted I, shaking the housekeeper violently by the shoulder, for her words seared my very soul, and I was frantic. "Mean!" continued she. "I mean that Emily will never see anybody again, and if she had 1,000 eyes, you are the last person upon whom she would wish to look." "Does Emily hate me too?" burst from me then, in the form of a soliloquy rather than a question. The reply was ready, however. "Hate you? Yes, more than that. She cannot find words that are bad enough for you. She mutters, even in her pain, 'Cruel, wicked,' and so on. She even shudders at the sound of your name, and we are all forbidden to speak it in her presence." I waited to hear no more, but turning, rushed out of the house. That moment was the crisis of my life. The thunderbolt had fallen upon and crushed me. My hopes, my happiness, my fortune, my good name, had gone before, but one solitary light had, until now, glimmered in the darkness. It was Emily's love. I had trusted in that only. It had passed away, and with it my youth, my faith, my hope of heaven. I was a blank on the earth, and cared not whither I went, or what became of me. From that moment I ceased to be myself. Then fell upon me the cloud in which I have ever since been shrouded, and under the shadow of which you have seen and known me. In that instant the blight had come, under the gnawing influence of which my happy laugh changed to the bitter smile, my frank and pleasant speech to tones of ill-concealed irony and sarcasm. My hair became prematurely gray, my features sharp, and oftentimes severe. My fellow men, to whom it had been my noblest hope to prove some day a benefactor, were henceforth the armed hosts of antagonists, with whom I would wage endless war, and the God whom I had worshipped, whom I had believed in, as a just and faithful friend and avenger. Who was he? Where was he? And why did he not right my cause? What direful and premeditated deed of darkness had I been guilty of, that he should thus desert me? Alas, greatest of all misfortunes, I lost my faith in heaven. I know not what direction I took on leaving Mr. Graham's house. I have no recollection of any of the streets through which I passed, though doubtless they were all familiar, but I paused not, until, having reached the end of a wharf, I found myself gazing down into the deep water, longing to take one mad leap and lose myself in everlasting oblivion. But for this final blow, beneath which my manhood had fallen, I would have cherished my life, at least until I could vindicate its fair name. I would never have left a blackened memory for men to dwell upon, and for Emily to weep over. But now what cared I for my fellow men? And Emily, she had ceased to love, and would not mourn, and I longed for nothingness and the grave. There are moments in human life when a word, a look, or a thought, may weigh down the balance in the scales of fate, and decide a destiny. So it was with me. I was incapable of forming any plan for myself, but accident as it were decided for me. I was startled from the apathy into which I had fallen by the sudden splashing of oars in the water beneath, and in a moment a little boat was moored to a pier within a rod of the spot where I stood. At the same instant I heard quick footsteps on the wharf, and turning, saw by the light of the moon, which was just appearing from behind a heavy cloud, a stout seafaring man, with a heavy pea-jacket under one arm, and an old-fashioned carpet-bag in his left hand. He had a ruddy, good-humoured face, and as he approached, and was about to pass me and leap into the boat, where two sailors, with their oars dipped and ready for motion, were awaiting him, he slapped me heartily on the shoulder and exclaimed, "Well, my fine fellow, will you ship with us?" I answered as readily in the affirmative, and with one look in my face and a glance at my dress, which seemed to assure him of my station in life, and probable ability to make compensation for the passage, he said in a laughing tone, "In with you, then." To his astonishment, for he had scarcely believed me in earnest, I sprang into the boat, and in a few moments was on board of a fine bark, bound I knew not whither. The vessel's destination proved to be Rio Janeiro, a fact which I did not learn, however, till we had been 2 or 3 days at sea, and to which, even then, I felt wholly indifferent. There was one other passenger beside myself, the captain's daughter, Lucy Gray, whom, during the first week, I scarcely noticed, but who appeared to be as much at home, whether in the cabin or on deck, as if she had passed her whole life at sea. I might, perhaps, have made the entire passage without giving another thought to this young girl, half child, half woman, had not my strange and mysterious behavior led her to conduct in a manner which at first surprised and finally interested me. My wild and excited countenance, my constant restlessness, avoidance of food, and apparent indifference to everything that went on about me, excited her wonder and sympathy to the utmost. She at first believed me partially deranged, and treated me accordingly. She would take a seat on deck directly opposite mine, look in my face for an hour, either ignorant or regardless of my observing her, and then walk away with a heavy sigh. Occasionally she would come and offer me some little delicacy, begging that I would try and eat; and as, touched by her kindness, I took food more readily from her hand than any other, these little attentions became at last habitual. As my manners and looks grew calmer, however, and I settled into a melancholy, which, though equally deep, was less fearful than the feverish torment under which I had labored, she became proportionately reserved, and when at last I began to appear somewhat like my fellow men, went regularly to the table, and instead of pacing the deck all night, spent a part of it, at least, quietly in my stateroom, Lucy absented herself wholly from that part of the vessel where I passed the greater portion of the day, and I seldom exchanged a word with her, unless I purposely sought her society. We experienced much stormy weather, however, which drove me to the cabin, where she usually sat on the transom, reading, or watching the troubled waves, and as the voyage was very long, we were necessarily thrown much in each other's way, especially as Captain Gray, the same individual who had invited me to ship with him, and who seemed still to take an interest in my welfare, good-naturedly encouraged an intercourse by which he probably hoped I might be won from a state of melancholy that seemed to astonish and grieve the jolly shipmaster almost as much as it did his kind-hearted, sensitive child. Lucy's shyness, therefore, wore gradually away, and before our tedious passage was completed, I ceased to be a restraint upon her. She talked freely with, or rather to me, for while, notwithstanding her occasional intimations of curiosity, I maintained a rigid silence concerning my own past experiences, of which I could scarcely endure to think, much less to speak, she exerted herself freely for my entertainment, and related, with simple frankness, almost every circumstance of her past life. Sometimes I listened attentively; sometimes, absorbed in my own painful reflections, I would be deaf to her voice, and forgetful of her presence. In the latter case, I would often observe, however, that she had suddenly ceased speaking, and starting from my reverie, and looking quickly up, would find her eyes fixed upon me so reproachfully, that, rallying my self-command, I would endeavour to appear, and not unfrequently really became, seriously interested in the artless narratives of my little entertainer. She told me that until she was 14 years old she lived with her mother in a little cottage on Cape Cod, their home being only occasionally enlivened by the return of her father from his long absences at sea. They would then usually make a visit to the city where his vessel lay, pass a few weeks in uninterrupted enjoyment, and at length return home to mourn the departure of the cheerful, light-hearted sea captain, and patiently count the weeks and months until he would come back again. She told me how her mother died at last, how bitterly she mourned her loss, and how her father wept when he came home and heard the news; how she had lived on shipboard ever since, and how sad and lonely she felt in time of storms, when, the master at his post of duty, she sat alone in the cabin, listening to the roar of wind and waves. Tears would come into her eyes when she spoke of these things, and I would look upon her with pity, as one whom sorrow made my sister. Trial, however, had not yet robbed her of an elastic, buoyant spirit, and when, 5 minutes after the completion of some eloquent little tale of early grief, the captain would approach unseen, and surprise her by a sudden joke, exclamation, or sly piece of mischief, thus provoking her to retaliate, she was always ready and alert for a war of wits, a laughing frolic, or even a game of romps. Her sorrow forgotten, and her tears dried up, her merry voice and her playful words would delight her father, and the cabin or the deck would ring with his joyous peals of laughter; while I, shrinking from a mirth and gaiety sadly at variance with my own unhappiness, and the sound of which was discordant to my sensitive nerves, would retire to brood over miseries for which it was hopeless to expect sympathy, which could not be shared, and with which I must dwell alone. Such a misanthrope had my misfortunes made me, that the sportive raillery between the captain and his merry daughter, and the musical laugh with which he would respond to the occasional witticisms of one or two old and privileged sailors, grated upon my ears like something scarce less than personal injuries; nor could I have believed it possible that one so little able as Lucy to comprehend the depths of my sufferings, could feel any sincere compassion for them, had I not once or twice been touched to see how her innocent mirth would give place to sudden gravity and sadness of countenance, if she chanced unexpectedly to encounter my woe-begone face, rendered doubly gloomy when contrasted with the gaiety of herself and her companions. But I must not linger too long upon the details of our life on shipboard, for I have to relate events which occupied many years, and must confine myself, as far as possible, to a concise statement of facts. I must forbear giving any account of a terrific gale that we encountered, during which, for 2 days and a night, poor Lucy was half frantic with fear, while I, careless of outward discomforts, and indifferent to personal danger, was afforded an opportunity to requite her kindness by such protection and encouragement as I was able to render. But this, and various other incidents of the voyage, all bore a part in inspiring her with a degree of confidence in me, which by the time we arrived in port was put to a severe and somewhat embarrassing test. Chapter 47.